So now we're going to talk about detecting outliers, and then after that we'll talk about a little bit about skewness, since we just talked about the normal distribution. In the video after this we'll look a little bit at skewness. Okay, and I think we've already discussed this a little bit, but we'll see that in the video after this one. But first we're going to talk about outliers, because we're talking about like z-scores. And a z is, again, if you look at our notes here, right, the number of standard deviations a data point is away from the mean. And it can be used here as like, how many standard deviations, right, are we talking about here? Are we talking about 1.5? Are we talking about 2 or 3 or 4? So z is like the number of standard deviations, whether it's for an individual data point, or we're doing it down here to figure out within this area from left to right on both sides of the mean, we have a certain amount of data. We could use Chebyshev's theorem. Or down here in the empirical rule, we're talking about how many standard deviations. Again, z is about standard deviations, but here it's like we're just talking about standard deviations. How much data is within a certain number of standard deviations? So that's what we're looking at, and we could use the z-score to figure out outliers, and I mentioned this already. So an outlier is an unusually small or unusually large value in a data set, and a data value with a z-score that is 3, -3 or +3 standard deviations, right? This is the number of standard deviations, the z-score, away from the mean might be considered an outlier. It might be incorrectly recorded data value, a data value that was incorrectly included in the data set, or a correctly recorded unusual data value that belongs in the data set, but something that we should like maybe take a look at, like, wow, it's a really different piece of data. How did that student do so well, or whatever, right? Like, bring some insight into it. It's an outlier. There's actually an entire book called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, which talks about people who like do incredibly better than most in certain areas, and so that's the book Outliers. Yep. And so here's like an example, and in here, right, calculate the z-score, the data point minus the mean divided by standard deviations gives us this z-score, and it's saying that -1.5 shows the fifth class size the farthest from the mean, has the biggest z-score, but there are no outliers present as the z values are within the ±3 guideline. That's how you use z-scores to help identify outliers. All right, that's what outliers are about. And a z-score of 3 or more is a possible outlier, and that's kind of the rule. And if something is 3 or more standard deviations away from the mean, then that might be a potential outlier. That's outlier.